All right, so let's unpack this kind of dramatic moment, right, in U.S. political history. We're talking about Congressman Al Green's removal from the House chamber during President Trump's 2025 address. I mean, just picture this Trump, for fresh off his new term, is giving this key speech, laying out the agenda, and then bam, right in the middle of it all, Al Green interrupts, gets escorted out. It was wild. So the question is, why did Green take such a drastic action, and what does it tell us about, the state of political discourse today?
Well, I think it's important to remember the context here. It was March 5th, 2025, Trump's first big speech after getting another term. There were these high expectations, like this feeling that he was going to use this moment to really set the tone for, his next 4 years. And he did, talking about a mandate for change, proposing some pretty sweeping policy shifts.
Including some pretty controversial cuts to Medicaid.
Right.
The government program that provides health coverage to millions of Americans, many of whom are low income or have disabilities. Maybe we should unpack mandate a bit, since that seems pretty central to this whole thing.
Yeah, good point, mandate. It gets thrown around a lot in politics. But what does it actually mean? I mean, on one hand, you could say that just winning an election gives a president a mandate to enact their agenda. I mean, they're chosen by the people, right?
But on the other hand, it's not always so simple, is it? Especially in a system as divided as ours. I mean, a president can win, but with a really small margin, or without a clear majority of the popular vote.
Exactly. And that's where things get a little tricky, because if a big chunk of the population doesn't feel represented by, the winning candidate, can we really say they have like a true mandate?
And it seems like this whole mandate question is exactly what set Al Green off.
You're right. He definitely felt like Trump was overstepping, especially with these proposed Medicaid cuts.
Okay, so let's talk about that outburst. I mean, heckling is one thing, but this was a whole other level.
It was Trump's in the middle of his speech talking about these policy changes, and suddenly Green jumps up and shouts, "He has no mandate!" And the chamber, oh man, you can just imagine,
erupted. And then he follows that up with, "You have no mandate to cut Medicaid," which really gets to the core of his protest. This wasn't just, general disapproval. He was specifically going after those cuts and the impact they would have on vulnerable communities.
And that makes sense given Green's background. He's a longtime advocate for social programs, and he represents a district with a lot of people who depend on Medicaid.
So for him, this wasn't just some policy debate. This was personal. He felt like he had to speak up for those people, even if it meant going against congressional decorum, which, by the way, is something that pretty much never happens during a presidential address.
It's super rare to see a lawmaker physically removed from the chamber like that. It really highlights how strong Green's convictions were and the lengths he was willing to go to have his voice heard.
And it wasn't even his first time challenging Trump, right? Didn't he try to impeach him before?
He did. Green was one of the first members of Congress to call for Trump's impeachment back in 2017 and again in 2019. So this wasn't just like a spur of the moment thing. It was part of a bigger pattern of, dissent. He clearly felt that the usual ways of protesting weren't working, that he needed to do something more drastic.
Which brings up a really interesting question. Did this whole impulsive move actually help his cause or hurt it? On the one hand, it definitely got people's attention. It put the issue of Medicaid cuts right in the national spotlight in a way that a press release or, a floor speech never could.
But then again, it also alienated a lot of people. Some people saw it as disrespectful, a breach of protocol. They argued that even if you disagree with the president, you got to show a certain level of decorum, like some respect for the office.
And what about within his own party? Did everybody support what he did?
Not completely. While a lot of Democrats praised Green for his courage, there were some who weren't so sure. Even the ones who shared his worries about the Medicaid cuts felt like interrupting the president wasn't the right way to go about it. They worried it might actually backfire and make it harder to find some common ground on these issues.
So even within the Democratic Party, there's this debate about the best way to approach this kind of dissent.
Absolutely. And that kind of speaks to a bigger tension that we're seeing in politics these days.
Right.
The struggle between, really passionate advocacy and the need for civility and a constructive dialogue.
So what was Green's response to all the criticism?
He didn't back down at all. He said he was ready to face the consequences for what he did, because he felt like it was his moral obligation to stand up for the people he represents, for the ones who would be hit hardest by these proposed cuts. He was willing to put principle over politics, even if it meant putting his own career on the line.
A strong message, for sure. But does it go beyond just his own supporters? That's what we'll look at in the next part of our deep dive. It's interesting how Green's actions have really kicked off this whole conversation about political protests. I mean, we've seen lawmakers show their dissent in other ways before, like walking out during speeches, refusing to applaud, wearing stuff to make a statement. But to actually be physically removed from the chamber during a presidential address,
Yeah.
that feels different, like a real escalation.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. It makes us think about the history of protests in Congress and how they've changed over time. You mentioned some examples like boycotts, symbolic clothes. These have been used pretty effectively to get a message across without actually like disrupting the
All right.
proceedings.
Those actions definitely send a message, but they don't directly interfere with the speaker or, the event itself.
Exactly. Green's outburst, on the other hand, was like a straight up interruption, a direct challenge to the president's authority right then and there. And that's what makes it so unprecedented. It really pushes the limits of what's considered okay in that kind of setting.
So then where do we draw the line? How far is too far when it comes to, speaking your mind in a political situation?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. I mean, on the one hand, we value free speech and the right to protest. We want our elected officials to be passionate and to stand up for what they believe in.
But at the same time, we also need some order and decorum in our political institutions.
Right.
If everybody just started yelling at anyone they disagreed with, it would be total chaos. Nothing would ever get done.
It's a tough balance, and Green's actions have really brought that tension to the forefront. They make us ask ourselves, how do we balance that need for passionate advocacy with the need for, civil discourse? How do we create a space where people can express their anger and frustration without resorting to tactics that undermine the whole democratic process?
And it's not just about finding that balance within Congress. It's about the bigger political climate in the country, too. Let's face it, things are pretty divided right now.
They are, and Green's outburst is kind of a symptom of that larger divide. We're seeing this growing polarization, this like erosion of civility and respect on both sides of the aisle.
And it feels like this incident is just feeding into that cycle,
Yeah.
adding fuel to the fire for both sides. You have those who are praising Green for his courage for speaking truth to power, and then you have those who are condemning him for being disrespectful, for undermining the office of the president.
And what's really worrying is that this whole thing could set a precedent. What if we start seeing more lawmakers following Green's lead, taking these dramatic stands, interrupting speeches, disrupting everything?
That's a scary thought, because if that becomes the new normal, it's hard to see how we can have any kind of productive conversation. It'll just be this constant back and forth of outrage and escalation.
Right. And that's why it's so important to have this conversation, to really think about what happened here, to understand the motivations and the consequences, because this isn't just about Al Green or Donald Trump. This is about the future of our democracy.
It's about our ability to, talk to each other, to find some middle ground even when we disagree really strongly.
And it's about figuring out how to take our passion and frustration and turn it into something productive. How do we make sure our voices are heard without resorting to tactics that just divide us even further?
So let's turn to you, our listeners. What do you think? Was Green right to do what he did? Did he go too far? And the most important question, where do we go from here? How do we move forward in a way that makes our democracy stronger instead of weaker? We really want to hear what you have to say.
Something that really hit me about all of this was Green's words, "He has no mandate." It's a pretty powerful statement, right? It's not just like he disagrees with the policy. It's like challenging whether Trump's presidency is even legitimate. His claim to speak for the people.
Right, it goes deeper than, I don't like this policy. It kind of makes you question like the whole basis of Trump's authority. And that brings up a really interesting question for us. What actually makes a mandate in a democracy like ours? Is it just winning the election, no matter how close it was? Or does it take something more?
That's a question political scientists have been arguing about forever. Some say a mandate means getting a clear majority of the votes, like a huge win that shows everyone exactly what the people want.
Others might say a mandate comes from having a specific platform, something that really connects with voters. And then you win based on that platform. So it's not just about the numbers, but about whether the leader's plans actually match what people want.
And to make things even more complicated, you have cases like this one where Trump won a second term. But the whole political climate is so divided. I mean, even though he technically has a mandate according to the rules, there are still tons of people who feel like they're not being heard or represented at all.
Which brings us back to Al Green and why he did what he did. It seems like he felt those Medicaid cuts were like a direct attack on the people he represents. Like they went against the whole idea of fairness and justice that he believes in.
And for him, that sense of moral duty might have been more important than any rules or traditions. He felt like he had to speak up for the people who would be hurt the most by these cuts, even if it meant breaking the rules.
It makes you think, right? Like, is there a point where the usual ways of protesting just aren't enough? When the system feels so stacked against you? When you feel like no one's listening? Maybe that's when people feel like they have to do something more extreme.
It's tough because while we can understand that frustration, we also got to think about what could happen if everyone does that. Protests that disrupt everything can push away people who might agree with you, and they can make people trust our political system even less.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Al Green's protest, I want to leave you with this. Imagine if instead of getting kicked out, Green had gotten the chance to really explain his concerns, like to have a real back and forth with the president about what those Medicaid cuts would actually mean. What if instead of shouting over each other, they had actually listened, really listened to each other's side?
It's a pretty interesting thought, isn't it? It makes us rethink how we talk about politics. To imagine a world where even when we disagree strongly, we can still try to understand each other and find solutions that work for everybody.
And it leaves us with this question. What would it take to make that happen? To have those kinds of conversations in the political world we live in today? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.